What happens when an 18-year-old girl realizes that the greatest threat to her multi-million-dollar inheritance isn't a stranger, but her own parents? When the people who say they're just trying to help show up the very next morning with a moving truck ready to take control of everything she just inherited. One night, it's a birthday celebration. The next morning, it's a takeover. In America, we grow up believing that family is supposed to protect you. But when family becomes a strategy for control, what comes first, loyalty or self-preservation? When you see the plan forming right in front of you, do you stay quiet to keep the peace? Or do you lock the door before it's too late? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now, let's listen to her from the heart. I woke up before the sun came up, not because of noise, but because my chest already felt tight. Lake Crescent was still silver in that early hour, the kind of pale light that makes everything look paused. The cabin smelled like damp cedar and cold air drifting in through the old window frames. For a few seconds, lying there on the narrow bed in the back room, I could almost pretend it was just another quiet morning. Then I saw the paper plates. They were stacked crookedly on the kitchen counter, frosting smeared along the edges. A string of gold ribbon had slipped off the back of a chair and pooled on the wooden floor. Half a sheet cake sat uncovered, the icing hardened around the knife marks. The air still carried faint traces of perfume and cheap champagne and the artificial sweetness of store-bought frosting. Last night had been loud, forced, bright. This morning was honest. I walked barefoot across the cool planks, ran my hand along the table Galen had built 30 years ago, and stood at the window looking out over the lake. It was so flat it looked like glass. No wind, no boats, no voices. The house felt like it was holding its breath. And maybe I was too, because last night in the middle of the noise and music and fake congratulations, I stepped away. Everyone had been gathered in the living room. My mother, Cinda, insisting on more photos. My father, Harlan, clapping me on the back like he'd just coached me to some victory. Beck laughing too loudly, already treating the cabin like it was an Airbnb he'd discovered first. They were all smiling, and I slipped down the narrow hallway toward the bathroom. I didn't go inside. I leaned against the wall instead and pulled my phone out of my pocket. Seth Harrow's email was open, waiting. Documents ready upon confirmation of legal age, it read. It had been drafted weeks ago, reviewed, re-reviewed. I turned 18 at 7:43 p.m. At 7:46 p.m., while my family poured more drinks and argued about what music to play next, I pressed confirm. The entire multi-million-dollar inheritance my grandparents left me, every account, every share, every dollar attached to the cabin and the land, moved into an irrevocable trust. Sole trustee Vesper Luxley. There was no shaking in my hands, no dramatic pause, no adrenaline spike, just a quiet sense of alignment. Preparation meeting execution. The system timestamped the filing, the confirmation notice appeared, recorded, done. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked back into the living room. My mother handed me the knife to cut the cake. My father raised a glass. Beck shouted, "Speech," I smiled. I thanked them for coming. I thanked them for supporting me. I laughed at something my Uncle Rourke said about big responsibilities. On the surface, nothing had changed, but I knew something had. I told myself I did it just as a precaution, but deep down I had already predicted this morning. The sound came around 6:12 a.m., tires grinding over gravel, not fast, not reckless, just steady, intentional. I didn't move right away. I stayed at the window and watched. A moving truck rolled into the drive first, large, white. Rental company logo splashed across the side. Behind it, my parents' SUV. Behind that, Beck's car. My stomach didn't drop. My body didn't go cold. It was almost worse than that. It felt expected. My father stepped out of the SUV first. He smoothed down his jacket like he was arriving at a business meeting. In his hand was a thick manila envelope. My mother climbed out next, already scanning the porch like she was assessing a property she'd just bought. Beck stepped out, last hands shoved in his pockets, looking around with a strange mix of curiosity and ownership. The movers hopped down from the truck, waiting for instructions. My father didn't knock. He walked halfway up the porch steps and called out, "Morning Vesper." His voice was bright. Too bright. "We got everything sorted," he said, lifting the envelope slightly. "This place is officially part of the family plan now." I stepped onto the porch barefoot, still holding the dish towel I'd used to dry my hands. "What does that mean?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. He gestured toward the truck. "It means," he said calmly, "we're going to streamline this. It doesn't make sense for you to manage a property like this on your own. We've arranged the paperwork. You can pack your things. We'll need you out by the end of the day." Behind him, my mother was already giving instructions to the movers. "Start with the larger pieces," she said, pointing through the window. "Dining table first, then the couch." Beck walked past them and onto the porch like he belonged there. He glanced down the hallway, then toward the back bedroom. "I'll take that room," he muttered under his breath, almost joking, almost not. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. My father turned back to me. "It's better this way," he said. "Trust me." I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just watched. Because I had been watching for years. My body wasn't in shock. My mind wasn't scrambling. It was almost calm, like the final piece of a pattern snapping into place. And then I saw it. A dark sedan parked slightly off to the side where gravel met grass. Seth Harrow stood beside it, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Next to him stood Deputy Lyle Moreno, posture relaxed but unmistakably official. They weren't rushing. They weren't waving. They were waiting. I had contacted Seth weeks ago. I had scheduled the meeting in Seattle months before that. I had anticipated that when my birthday passed and the legal barrier dropped, something would shift. I just didn't know how fast. Now I did. I stepped off the porch, slowly. Behind me, my mother was still directing movers. My father was still smiling. Beck was still wandering inside like he was house hunting. I walked down the gravel drive toward Seth and the deputy, knowing one thing for certain. Today was not going to unfold the way my family expected. People think moments like that start with money. They don't. They start years earlier. When I was 14, we were still living in Raleigh. Suburban street, trimmed lawns, two-car garage. Predictable. I came home from school one afternoon holding an envelope I'd opened on the bus because I couldn't wait. It was an acceptance letter into a competitive academic program. Full scholarship, prestigious, the kind of thing parents frame. My mom was at the kitchen counter on the phone writing something down on a grocery list. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I got in. She glanced at the paper, smiled quickly, and covered the receiver. "That's great, honey. Put it on the table. I'll look in a minute." She went back to her call. My father was in the den watching sports. When I told him, he nodded without looking away from the screen. "Good job," he said. "Keep it up." 10 minutes later, the entire house shifted. Beck had gotten into a fight at school. Suspension, parent meeting, team practice implications. Suddenly, everything revolved around him. My mother was calling the principal. My father was drafting emails. They were discussing legal rights, fairness, how boys will be boys. My letter stayed unopened on the counter until that night. I read it alone in my room. That was the first time I realized something important. My success was expected. His trouble was urgent. It wasn't a single event. It was a pattern. A year later, Beck scraped a neighbor's car while riding a bike my parents had bought him after football season. It wasn't a tiny scratch. It dented the panel. My parents wrote a check that afternoon. 2 weeks later, they upgraded his bike. They called it a lesson in responsibility. When I accidentally dropped one of my mother's ceramic bowls as a kid, I was grounded for 3 weeks. I stopped telling them things after that, not dramatically, quietly. I learned how to process good news alone, how to plan without announcing it, how to detach my emotional safety from their reactions. That's why the cabin felt different. Lake Crescent wasn't just a location, it was air I could breathe. Galen would hand me tools without hovering. If I misaligned a hinge, he'd show me once and let me fix it. He never raised his voice. Iris talked to me at the kitchen table about bills, property taxes, repairs. Not like I was a child, like I was capable. One night when the fire was low and the wind rattled the porch railing, Galen looked at me and said, "Your father chases control when he feels unstable. Your uncle chases shortcuts." He didn't say it bitterly. He said it plainly. Then he looked at me. "You don't drop what you're given," he said. "That matters." When he told me the cabin and the accounts would go to me, it didn't feel like winning something. It felt like being trusted. When both he and Iris passed within a year, the will reading in Seattle was straightforward, clean, specific. Everything went to me. Not shared, not divided, mine. For about 2 weeks, my family was subdued. Then the language shifted. It's a family place. We should all have access. It's too much responsibility for you. My Uncle Rourke started asking casual questions about online notary services, about deed adjustments, about simplifying ownership. At first, I thought he was just being himself. Then I overheard him telling my father, "Once she's 18, we can structure it differently." That sentence stayed with me. Once she's 18, not if she agrees, not if she wants to, once. That's when I scheduled the appointment with Seth Harrow. In a quiet office in Seattle that smelled like paper and coffee, he explained irrevocable trusts to me. How they work, how they protect assets, how they remove ambiguity. He warned me my family might react badly. I told him I expected that. When my parents said, "You're too young to understand taxes," I nodded. When they said, "We're just trying to help," I smiled. When they insisted on hosting my 18th birthday at the cabin, I agreed, because by then the paperwork was already drafted. When I pressed confirm in that hallway, it wasn't rebellion. It wasn't panic. It was the final step of something I had been building quietly for months. So when the moving truck rolled into the driveway the next morning, I didn't feel surprised. I felt prepared. And as I walked toward Seth and Deputy Moreno, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a spontaneous attempt to take control. It had been calculated. They had just underestimated me. I kept walking toward Seth and Deputy Moreno while my mother's voice carried across the yard, still giving instructions to men who had no idea they were about to load furniture that didn't belong to the people directing them. Seth met me halfway up the drive. "Good morning, Vesper," he said evenly, as if we were meeting for coffee instead of a confrontation. Deputy Moreno gave me a short nod. "Ma'am." Behind us, one of the movers had already stepped onto the porch and grabbed the edge of the dining table. Seth turned his tone, sharpening just enough. "I'm going to need everyone to pause." The mover froze mid-lift, glancing from Seth to my father. Harlan stepped forward, irritation flashing across his face. "Excuse me." Deputy Moreno stepped beside Seth, not aggressive, just present. "Sir, before any property is removed from this residence, we need to clarify legal ownership." My father gave a tight smile. "We've clarified it. That's why we're here." He held up the manila envelope like it was a trophy. I stood a few feet behind Seth, close enough to hear everything, far enough that my father couldn't reach out and grab my arm like he used to when I was younger and needed guidance. "Let's take a look," Seth said. My father handed over the envelope with confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from believing the outcome has already been decided. My mother crossed her arms. Beck lingered near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Seth opened the envelope, slowly sliding the documents out one at a time. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He scanned the first page, then the second. He flipped to the notarization page and held it up slightly toward the light. Deputy Moreno leaned in. I watched my father's expression carefully. At first, he looked pleased, almost smug. Then I saw it the first crack. "This notary credential number doesn't exist in the state database," Seth said calmly, "and the seal formatting is inconsistent with Washington state requirements." My father's jaw tightened. "It's a remote notary. Completely legal." Seth nodded slightly. Remote notarization is legal. Fabricated credentials are not. He turned another page. The signature attributed to Galen Sloan does not match the specimen on record from the original deed. My mother stepped forward. That's ridiculous. You can't just eyeball that. I'm not eyeballing. Seth replied, I'm comparing against filed records. He handed one sheet to Deputy Moreno. You'll also notice the document was allegedly executed 3 years ago. However, the form version wasn't published until 18 months ago. Silence stretched across the yard. The movers slowly set the table back down. My father's face shifted from certainty to calculation. This is procedural, he said, voice harder now. We were advised this was appropriate. By whom? Seth asked. There was a flicker of hesitation. Before my father could answer, Beck spoke. I signed some stuff, he blurted out. Dad said it was just paperwork so we could manage the place together. Everything stopped. Deputy Moreno looked directly at Beck. You signed documents related to this property. Beck's eyes widened, realizing he'd stepped into something heavier than he understood. I don't know. It was just like acknowledgement forms. My father turned sharply. Beck, that's enough. But it wasn't. Deputy Moreno pulled out a small notebook. Sir, if a minor signed any property transfer documentation under misrepresentation, that becomes relevant. Beck swallowed. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not exactly. Recognition. He hadn't understood. He'd been told it was routine, just like everything else in our house. Seth slid a separate folder from under his arm. This, he said, holding it up, is the trust summary. He opened it so both my father and Deputy Moreno could see. Effective at 7:46 p.m. last night, immediately following Ms. Luxley's 18th birthday, all assets associated with the Sloan estate, including this property, were transferred into an irrevocable trust. My father blinked. That's not possible. It is, Seth said. Time-stamped, recorded, verified. He handed over the confirmation sheet. The time was clear. The digital filing receipt number was clear. My name was clear. Sole trustee. The property was no longer sitting in my personal name in a way that could be casually restructured. Deputy Moreno reviewed the paperwork and nodded. As of this filing, Ms. Luxley is the authorized legal controller of this property through the trust structure. The air changed. The moving truck engine idled uselessly. My mother's hands dropped from her hips. My father's grip on the envelope tightened until the paper bent. Seth continued almost as an afterthought. Additionally, the remote notarization platform provided log records. He turned the folder so my father could see. There were multiple submission attempts for property-related documents over the last several weeks, all originating from the same device, same IP range. My father's eyes flicked up sharply. Those attempts were rejected, Seth went on. Incorrect credentials, improper formatting. In one case, an attempt to file a shared interest agreement backdated to suggest prior consent from the decedents. My heart didn't race. It settled. This hadn't been an impulsive morning decision. It had been rehearsed, tested, adjusted. Deputy Moreno looked at my father. Sir, based on what I'm seeing, there's no lawful authority for you to remove any property from this residence. The movers stepped back completely now, uncertainty replacing efficiency. I stepped forward then. My voice didn't shake. I need you to leave, I said. My mother stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Honey, this is insane, she whispered. My father's face hardened into something colder than anger. This isn't over, he said quietly. I held his gaze. I know, I replied. And the strangest part was his words didn't scare me. They confirmed what I already understood. This was only the beginning. I stood on the porch and watched the moving truck reverse slowly down the gravel drive. The SUV followed. Beck's car lingered a second longer, then pulled away too. The dust they kicked up hung in the morning air before settling back onto the stones. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the pause before something bigger crested. Seth didn't rush off. He set his laptop on Galen's old outdoor table and began typing, immediately documenting the encounter while details were fresh. Deputy Moreno approached me before leaving. "Here's the case number," he said, handing me a small slip of paper. "If they return or attempt entry, again call immediately." I thanked him. When he drove off, the yard was quiet again. Seth turned the laptop slightly toward me. "I want you to see this," he said. He opened an email chain from the remote notarization platform, confirmation messages, rejection notices, timestamps. He clicked into a metadata summary. "The IP address traces back to Raleigh," he said. "Residential provider. Same subnet registered to your parents' home." I stared at the numbers. It felt surreal how something so clinical could represent something so personal. "There's more," he added. He pulled up additional logs. There weren't just 1 or 2 attempts. There were at least 3 rejected filings before this morning. He opened a draft labeled Shared Interest Agreement. It claimed that Galen and Iris had voluntarily agreed years ago to designate the cabin as a family shared property. The execution date predated Iris's final medical procedure. The form version, however, hadn't existed at that time. They were testing language, Seth said, trying to find a structure that would slip through. I exhaled slowly. They hadn't been waiting for my birthday to talk. They'd been waiting to act. If a cloud title had been recorded, Seth continued, you'd be looking at prolonged litigation. Even if you ultimately won, the property would be tied up for years. They didn't just want the cabin, they wanted leverage, exhaustion, pressure. The words my father had used, "this isn't over," were not emotional. They were strategic. Seth began outlining next steps. "We changed the locks today," he said. "Install cameras if you haven't already. Notify the recorder's office in Port Angeles to flag any new filings requiring direct verification. We monitor daily. 60 days, I said. He looked at me. Not 30, I clarified. 60. He nodded once. Agreed. He clicked into another file. There's something else. 2 weeks prior, someone had accessed public land record searches under the name of a newly formed LLC. The LLC's registration listed a managing member, not directly my Uncle Rourke, but connected to him through prior filings. They were exploring indirect acquisition options, Seth said. The pattern deepened. That night, after Seth left and the new locks were installed, my phone started lighting up. My mother's name. Again. I let it ring twice before answering. She was crying at first. "How could you do this to us?" she said. "In front of strangers, in front of the movers." I stayed quiet. "You made your father look like a criminal." "He brought a moving truck," I replied. Her tone shifted quickly. "You embarrassed this family. People are going to talk." That word again. Family. As reputation. As image. My father took the phone. "If you think you're smarter than everyone," he said evenly, "we can settle this in court. I've already retained counsel," I answered. "You manipulated your grandparents," he continued. "We can have their capacity reviewed." There it was. The threat wasn't about property. It was about rewriting the story. "I won't discuss this directly," I said. "Any communication goes through Seth." He exhaled sharply. "You're making a mistake." I ended the call. The cabin was dark except for the small lamp in the corner of the living room. Outside, Lake Crescent reflected the moon in a thin silver line. I stood at the window for a long time. This wasn't just about protecting an inheritance. It wasn't even just about protecting a cabin. It was about dismantling a structure that had always told me I owed obedience more than autonomy. And as the lake remained still under the night sky, I understood something clearly. I wasn't just defending property. I was confronting the way power had always worked in my family, and I wasn't stepping back. The next morning, Seth called before I'd even finished my coffee. His voice wasn't urgent, but it was deliberate. "We received a formal letter," he said, "from attorney Kendra Vale." I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the lake through the window. "I'm guessing it's not an apology." "No," he replied. "It's a demand." He forwarded the document while we were still on the phone. I opened it and read slowly. Attorney Vale asserted that there had been a long-standing family understanding regarding the cabin. According to her letter, the property was always intended to function as a shared family asset, and my decision to consolidate control violated that expectation. She suggested the will and trust arrangement did not reflect the true spirit of my grandparents' wishes. The language was careful, polished, measured, but the message underneath it was clear. They were reframing the story. Further down the page, the tone shifted. It implied that Galen and Iris Sloan may have been vulnerable in their final year, that decisions made during that time should be reviewed, that outside influence could not be ruled out. I felt something tighten inside me. This was the first time they had moved beyond me. They were questioning my grandparents' clarity, their competence, their dignity. The letter formally requested access to medical records from the final year of both their lives. It suggested that a review of capacity might become necessary if informal resolution was not reached. I lowered the phone and closed my eyes. My grandparents had spent their final years steady, alert, deliberate. Galen still argued about property tax assessments with more precision than most accountants. Iris read 3 newspapers every morning and corrected articles in the margins. To see their memory reduced to legal leverage felt like a violation. "Seth," I said quietly, "they're not just coming after me." "I know," he answered. "That's why we respond in writing." After we hung up, I walked down the hallway to the narrow closet beside the guest room. At the back, behind a folded blanket, sat a small metal lockbox. Iris had shown it to me months before she passed. Not because I expect trouble, she'd said, handing me the key, but because I know patterns. I unlocked it and carried it to the dining table. Inside were folders labeled in Iris's neat handwriting, taxes, insurance, deeds, correspondence, family. I opened the last one. The first document was titled plainly, Family Requests and Responses. Each page recorded a specific request made by my father, my mother, or my Uncle Rourke over the years. Request to add Harlan Luxley to the deed for convenience. Response: no. Request to sell a portion of the lakeside acreage and reinvest. Response: number request to create a shared usage agreement granting rotating control. Response number: every response was dated. Every response carried Galen's firm signature. Some had short notes in the margin. Not appropriate. Asset remains independent. Decision final. I sat back in my chair. They hadn't misremembered. They had been refused, and now they were trying to reconstruct history. At the bottom of the folder was an envelope with my name written across it. Vesper. I opened it carefully. Iris's handwriting filled 2 pages. If anyone pressures you about the cabin or the accounts, call Seth. Do not sign anything. Do not hand over keys. Do not argue. Let the paperwork speak. Halfway down the second page, a sentence made my pulse slow. We suspect someone attempted to inquire about our banking credentials last winter. We changed passwords immediately. Be careful. I read that line twice. They had known. They had seen the early signs. I closed the letter and sat there for a long time. When Seth arrived later that afternoon, I handed him the folder. He read through it without interrupting. This, he said, finally tapping the page with Galen's signature, is direct evidence of intent. He drafted a formal response to Attorney Vale that evening. The letter included the trust summary timestamp confirmation, the case number provided by Deputy Moreno, and copies of the documented refusals from the family folder. It stated clearly that any further attempt to challenge the estate's integrity would be met with full evidentiary review. It demanded preservation of evidence relating to the devices and accounts used to submit prior unauthorized filings. The tone was calm. It did not accuse. It did not insult. It simply laid out facts. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to raise my voice to be heard. The truth written down and filed correctly carried weight on its own. That night, when the cabin settled into quiet again, I didn't feel small. I felt anchored, and I understood that if they wanted to fight, they would have to do it in daylight on record. The shift came quickly. 3 days after Seth sent the response, my phone began lighting up with notifications from Raleigh. My mother had posted. The post was long, emotional, carefully phrased. She described how she and my father had driven across state lines to celebrate their daughter's milestone birthday, only to be humiliated and escorted away from property that had always been part of the family. She wrote that I had locked them out of their own memories. She never mentioned the moving truck. She never mentioned the documents. Within hours, comments flooded in. Friends from church, neighbors, former classmates' parents. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Kids these days are so entitled. She'll understand one day." I scrolled through them slowly. Each comment felt like a stone placed carefully in a narrative I didn't recognize. The worst part wasn't anger. It was how easily the story was believed. Then I saw the video. It was a clip from my birthday party. Short. Edited. It showed me cutting the cake, barely smiling, saying thank you in a flat tone. The audio cut just before the moment where I laughed at something Beck said. The caption read, "Hard to watch when your own child shuts you out." My chest tightened. The cabin felt suddenly smaller again. I called Seth. "Don't respond publicly," he said immediately. "Archive everything." He explained that reacting emotionally would only feed the narrative. Documentation was more powerful. He drafted another letter to Attorney Vail requesting immediate cessation of defamatory implications and misleading public statements. Vail responded that her clients were merely expressing personal experiences and had not made any factual misrepresentations. It was a technical answer. Carefully evasive. A few days later, I received a text from Beck. "Are you really going to take this all the way?" I stared at the message before replying. "What does that mean?" He responded almost immediately. "Dad and Uncle Rourke are talking about finding someone who'll say Grandma told them the cabin was supposed to be shared." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. They were preparing witnesses. Manufactured memory dressed as testimony. I typed back. "Do you believe that—" There was a long pause before he answered. "I don't know anymore." That uncertainty was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in weeks. After I showed the messages to Seth, he leaned back in his chair. "If they intend to escalate," he said, "we should move first." He outlined the option clearly. We could file for formal protective relief through the court in Clallam County, seek judicial affirmation of the trust's validity, request injunction against further interference or harassment related to the property. It would take the situation out of rumor and into record. It would make the lines visible. Once we file, Seth said, this stops being family disagreement. It becomes structured litigation. I walked out onto the porch and looked at the lake. The camera we'd installed near the entrance blinked steadily in the corner of my vision. The cabin no longer felt fragile. It felt defended. If I waited, they would continue testing angles, social pressure, witness statements, public narrative. If I acted, the story would shift to documentation and evidence. I turned back toward Seth. "File it," I said. He nodded once. That night, after he left, I stood at the edge of the dock. The air was cold and clean. For a moment, I thought about the version of me at 14, holding that acceptance letter alone in her bedroom. She would have stayed quiet to keep peace. She would have absorbed the discomfort to avoid confrontation. But I wasn't 14 anymore. The camera light blinked green behind me. The locks on the doors were new, and for the first time, the cabin wasn't just where I escaped. It was where I chose to stand. I knew the next stage would be public, structured, final, and I was ready to meet it. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, Seth had everything organized into clean binders tabs, labeled with precision but emotionally. For the first time, the story that had lived inside my family was moving into a courtroom. We filed for protective relief in Clallam County Superior Court. The petition requested formal confirmation of the validity of the irrevocable trust and an order preventing further interference, harassment, or attempts to cloud the title of the property. Every piece of evidence we had gathered was attached. the trust summary with its exact timestamp, 7:46 p.m., the remote notarization logs, IP address confirmations, device fingerprint reports, copies of the rejected filings, the family requests and responses documents from the lockbox, Iris's letter. When I signed the verification page under penalty of perjury, I felt the shift. This was no longer a private standoff at a gravel driveway. It was record, public, structured. Attorney Kendra Vale responded within days. Her filing requested the court consider whether Galen and Iris Sloan possessed full testamentary capacity during the final year of their lives. She attached routine medical checkup summaries highlighting language that referenced medication adjustments and age-related monitoring. Reading it made my throat tighten. They weren't accusing my grandparents outright. They were suggesting doubt, planting questions in the margins. The implication was simple: if capacity could be questioned, then intent could be questioned. If intent could be questioned, then everything else could unravel. I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread in front of me and thought about Iris correcting newspaper articles with a pen in the margin, about Galen recalculating insurance premiums in his head. The idea that they were confused or manipulated felt absurd. But absurdity doesn't stop legal strategy. The hearing was set quickly. Port Angeles is not a large city, and the courthouse reflects that clean, functional, not grand. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside with Seth while fog drifted low over the water. "Speak clearly," he told me. "Stick to facts." Inside the courtroom, my parents sat 2 rows behind their attorney. Beck sat beside my mother. Uncle Rourke was there too, arms folded, eyes forward. No one smiled. When I was called, I walked to the front and took the oath. I described the morning the moving truck arrived, the envelope in my father's hand, my mother directing movers, the instruction that I pack and leave. Deputy Lyle Moreno testified after me. He confirmed he had observed an attempted removal of property and halted activity pending clarification of ownership. Seth then presented the technical evidence. The remote notarization logs were displayed on a monitor for the court. Submission attempt 1, submission attempt 2, submission attempt 3, all rejected, all originating from the same IP range. An independent IT specialist, Seth, had retained explained the device fingerprint analysis. The data matched a laptop registered under the Internet Service account at my parents' address in Raleigh. The timestamps showed the earliest submission attempts occurred weeks before my 18th birthday. That detail settled heavily in the room. It meant the effort to restructure control began while I was still legally a minor. It meant they were waiting. Attorney Vale attempted to redirect focus, returning to the question of capacity. She suggested that advanced age and medical oversight could raise concerns about external influence. Seth responded by introducing the family requests and responses documents. Page after page was placed before the judge. Request to add Harlan Luxley to the deed. Response: no. Request to sell acreage. Response: no. Each refusal dated. Each refusal signed. The judge studied the documents carefully. Then Beck was called. He looked younger in that room than he ever had at the cabin. Smaller. Under questioning, he repeated that my father only wanted to protect the property for his sister, that everything was meant to help. But when asked directly whether he had signed documents without reading them thoroughly, Beck hesitated. Yes, he admitted. I thought it was just internal paperwork. And when were these documents prepared? Seth asked gently. Before Vesper's birthday, Beck answered. The courtroom grew quiet. The judge asked a final series of questions about the trust execution. Seth provided the timestamp verification and filing receipt. After a short recess, the judge returned and delivered a preliminary ruling. The court recognized the trust as validly executed and effective as of the timestamp recorded. The documented refusals in the family folder demonstrated clear intent by the decedents not to share ownership of the property. A temporary protective order would be issued prohibiting any further attempts to interfere with the property or trust assets pending final resolution. The words were measured, procedural, but they carried weight. When we stepped outside into the pale afternoon light, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steadied. The truth had been spoken aloud on record. Still, I knew something else just as clearly. This wasn't entirely finished. The tone shifted after the hearing. Attorney Vale sent formal notice that her clients would suspend direct challenges to the trust's structure while reviewing the court's preliminary findings. Seth confirmed through daily monitoring that no additional filings had been submitted against the property. For the first time in weeks, the land records were quiet. I printed a certified copy of the court's protective order and placed it inside the metal lockbox alongside the trust summary and Iris's letter. The file felt complete in a way it hadn't before. A few days later, Seth called again. "This part is public record," he said. "You should hear it from me." He had reviewed business filings and financial disclosures connected to an LLC tied indirectly to my Uncle Rourke. Through related filings and court records in North Carolina, he uncovered substantial outstanding debt connected to a failed investment venture. My father's name appeared as a guarantor. The numbers were not small. The timeline aligned uncomfortably with the weeks leading up to my birthday. The cabin and the estate assets weren't simply convenient. They were a potential solution, a liquidity source. I sat in silence after he finished explaining. It didn't excuse anything, but it clarified the urgency behind the moving truck. That evening, my phone rang again. My father. His voice was different this time. Lower, slower. "I won't pretend we handled it well," he said. He didn't apologize. He stated, "We were in a difficult position." "I know," I replied. There was a pause. "We were trying to keep the family stable." He continued, "You don't understand what pressure feels like at my age." "I understand pressure," I said quietly. "I just don't use it on people." He exhaled. I did what I thought was necessary, for who I asked. Silence answered first, then for the family. I looked out at the lake. "Family doesn't mean taking control of something that isn't yours," I said. "It doesn't mean rewriting history." He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, but he didn't concede either. When we hung up, there was no promise of reconciliation, only distance. Later that week, Beck texted me, "I'm sorry." The message was short. I waited before responding. For what I asked, for going along with things, for not questioning it. He added another line. "I don't want to be part of that anymore." I stared at the words for a long time. Beck had always moved in the current of whatever force was strongest in the room. That was how he survived. I didn't turn him into an enemy. I didn't pull him close either. My boundaries remained intact. "You're responsible for your choices," I wrote back, "just like I am for mine." The cabin settled into a different rhythm after that. I replaced the final set of interior locks, installed additional exterior lighting, completed credit freezes with all 3 major bureaus, updated bank security questions and passphrases. I repaired the section of porch railing that had loosened over the winter, replanted Iris's herb garden near the side window. I worked slowly, deliberately. The cameras at the entrance blinked green each night, steady and uneventful. There were no more trucks, no envelopes, no surprise visitors. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the surface of Lake Crescent flatten into perfect stillness. It occurred to me then that the conflict had never truly been about money. Money was leverage. The real struggle had been about control, about who decides, about whether obedience is expected without question. The trust did more than protect assets. It protected my autonomy. The cabin wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a battlefield anymore either. It was air, space, choice. I leaned back in the chair Galen once built with his own hands. There were no engines in the driveway, no raised voices in the yard, just water, wood, wind. What I held on to wasn't just property. It was the ability to say no and have that no recognized by law. And that more than anything else was what remained. Sometimes the hardest thing we ever do isn't winning a fight. It's choosing where we draw the line. Tonight we watched a young woman learn that protecting herself didn't mean she stopped loving her family. It meant she finally loved herself enough to stand steady. In every family, there are quiet expectations, unspoken hierarchies, and old patterns that shape who gets heard. And sometimes growth isn't loud. It's a signature on a document, a boundary spoken calmly, a door closed without anger. There's something tender in that realization. We can hold compassion for people's fears and still refuse to carry their consequences. We can understand someone's pressure without surrendering our own future. Maybe that's the deeper lesson here, that strength and kindness are not opposites. They can exist in the same breath. If this story stirred something in you and you'd like to be part of a space where we sit with stories like this, honestly, without judgment, consider subscribing. It's not just about the next episode, it's about building a community that listens. And if you feel comfortable, leave a few lines in the comments. Sometimes sharing even a small piece of your own experience reminds someone else they're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you're listening from, take care of your heart. We'll meet again soon, and until then, may we all choose our boundaries with grace.